Magic Johnson. Even if you never watched a full NBA game, that name still lands like a headline. It carries the weight of a golden era in Los Angeles. The Showtime Lakers, the no-look passes that looked like sleight of hand, the grin that made victory feel inevitable. For years, Magic wasn't just a player. He was the mood of a nation watching basketball turn into entertainment, into art, into proof that joy could be engineered with a fast break and perfect timing. On paper, his life reads like the cleanest version of the American dream. 5 championships, 3 MVP awards, a Hall of Fame legacy, then a second act as a business titan and billionaire investor. The story looks polished, complete, almost untouchable. But the most haunting part of Magic Johnson's life is not in the trophies or the contracts. It's in the quiet space behind the smile, where a man who seemed invincible learned that the world can change with a single test result. Because at the peak of his power, when he still looked like the future of the NBA, Magic stepped in front of microphones and delivered a sentence that froze time. He had tested positive for HIV, and he was retiring immediately. In that moment, the spotlight that once made him shine became a spotlight that burned. The crowd didn't just gasp. Society judged. People feared. People whispered. And in an era when HIV was widely treated like a death sentence, the announcement didn't feel like news. It felt like an ending. The tragedy wasn't only the diagnosis. It was what came after, the distance in people's body language, the sudden caution where there had once been celebration, the quiet sense that the world was backing away. Magic Johnson had spent his entire life proving he was more than what others tried to reduce him to. And now, no matter how many rings he wore, one word threatened to swallow the rest of his identity. To understand why that hits so hard, you have to rewind to Lansing, Michigan, back to the beginning, long before arenas and cameras. He grew up in a working-class family where survival was measured in shifts worked, not applause earned. His father drove a garbage truck and labored in a factory. His mother cleaned classrooms. Their home had love, but not luxury. And outside that home, the world could be cruel. The video paints a childhood marked by ridicule. Kids mocking him for helping his father, turning honest work into a punchline, branding him with nicknames that made shame feel permanent. That's where the basketball came in. Not as a hobby, but as an escape route. The court was the one place where he could rewrite the story. Each early morning, each shot taken in cold air wasn't just practice. It was a declaration. I will not be defined by what you call me. And he succeeded. He became magic. He became larger than life. Which is exactly why the fall felt unbearable. Because the question that hangs over this story is not whether he was great. It's whether greatness can protect you when darkness shows up uninvited. And whether a man can keep smiling when he's secretly counting down the unknown. Magic Johnson didn't become a legend in a single night. He became one the slow way, by stacking days on top of days, by turning embarrassment into discipline, and by refusing to accept the small box the world wanted to place around a working-class black kid from Lansing. The video story leans heavily on that early wound, the childhood feeling of being laughed at for the life he didn't choose. When other kids mocked him for riding along on garbage runs with his father, it wasn't just teasing. It was a message. This is where you belong. This is all you'll ever be. That kind of message doesn't simply fade. It either breaks you or becomes fuel. And for Irvin Johnson Jr., basketball became the only place where the rules felt fair. On the court, the ball didn't care who his father was. The rim didn't care what neighborhood he came from. The scoreboard didn't care what nicknames someone shouted at him in the hallway. Every bounce was a chance to rewrite the day. Every sprint was a way to outrun shame. By the time he reached Michigan State University, the transformation was already underway. He wasn't just a talented player anymore. He was a young man carrying a private mission to prove permanently that he had value. The video frames this period as the first major shift because college didn't merely give him a bigger stage. It gave him an audience large enough to finally replace the insults with applause. And that's where the famous 1979 NCAA championship enters the story like a turning point scene in a film. Magic faced Larry Bird, and the matchup immediately became more than sports. The video emphasizes how America watched it as a symbolic collision. Black and white, city and rural, two different narratives competing under the same lights. When Michigan State won, it didn't just crown a champion. It crowned a character in the national imagination. Suddenly, the garbage man nickname had no power. A new name took its place, Magic, and people chanted it like a spell. But the tragedy of becoming Magic is that the nickname is both praise and prison. Once the world decides you're a miracle, it stops allowing you to be ordinary. It stops allowing you to be unsure, tired, or afraid. The video hints at the first cracks here. Even in the moments of celebration, there is pressure. Even in the glow of victory, there is loneliness. Because when you become the symbol of hope, you are expected to keep performing hope, even when you don't feel it. Then comes the NBA, and the pace intensifies. The Los Angeles Lakers select him first overall in 1979, dropping him into a city where basketball and celebrity merge into one constant spotlight. The video describes him as a player who didn't just fit into the league, he reshaped it. He made the point guard position feel like a conductor's role, controlling tempo and emotion. Under his control, the Lakers weren't merely winning, they were entertaining. Showtime wasn't a slogan. It was a style built around his creativity, his vision, his ability to make the impossible look casual. And the trophies followed. The championships, the MVPs, the magazine covers, the global attention. By the mid-1980s, Magic Johnson was not just a star. He was an institution. People didn't buy tickets only to see the Lakers. They bought tickets to see Magic be Magic, to witness the smile, the flair, the guaranteed thrill of something spectacular. But the video keeps returning to a darker idea. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. Behind the roaring arenas were brutal travel schedules, constant physical strain, and a relentless demand to never look weak. He could leave the court exhausted, but he still had to smile for cameras. He could feel pain in his body, but there was no permission to show it. And when the noise faded, the loneliness could feel louder than any crowd. That matters because it sets up the emotional contrast for what happens later. Magic's entire life had been defined by escape. Escape poverty, escape ridicule, escape being underestimated. He escaped it all by becoming the brightest thing in the room. And then, at the peak of his career, he faced something he could not simply outwork, outrun, or outshine. Because when the world knows you as Magic, it assumes you are protected. It assumes you are untouchable. That assumption is exactly what makes the next chapter so devastating. The video's underlying tension is simple but powerful. If a man who seemingly had everything could still be brought to his knees by fate, what does that say about the illusion of control we all cling to? By the end of this part of the story, Magic Johnson isn't just an athlete rising. He is an icon being built, brick, by public expectation. The same expectation that will later demand he remain strong, remain perfect, remain smiling even when his private world begins to collapse. By the early 1980s, Magic Johnson wasn't just living his dream, he was carrying everyone else's dream with him. In Los Angeles, basketball stopped feeling like a sport and started feeling like an event. The Lakers weren't simply winning, they were performing. And at the center of that performance stood a point guard who played like he could see the future a second before everyone else. A no-look pass wasn't a trick for him. It was his native language. The video frames this era as the moment Magic becomes more than a man. He becomes a symbol. Championships and MVPs pile up. The Showtime identity hardens into legend, and the world begins to expect something almost supernatural from him every single night. 5 titles, 3 MVPs. A face so famous it could sell tickets on its own. A smile so constant it started to look permanent. But permanent smiles can be the most dangerous kind, because they convince everyone that the person behind them never breaks. The story keeps circling one quiet truth. Greatness is expensive, not only physically, but emotionally. The NBA doesn't reward you for being human. It rewards you for being available, reliable, and indestructible. Magic's schedule was brutal. Flights, back-to-backs, interviews, cameras waiting even when the arena lights turned off. He could be exhausted, sore, drained, and still be required to give the public the same version of himself. Upbeat, confident, shining. That is how the trap is built. People stop asking how you are. They start demanding what you are. And in the videos telling, the trap gets tighter the bigger he becomes. The Lakers' success doesn't give him peace. It multiplies pressure. The more he wins, the more the world believes he must always win. The louder the applause, the less space there is for silence. And in the silence, a different Magic appears. One who sits alone after the locker room empties. One who stares into hotel mirrors and wonders whether anyone notices the fatigue behind the brightness. If Part 2 was about the rise, Part 3 is about the cost of being the rise. Because Magic Johnson didn't only represent basketball. He represented possibility. For many fans, especially in Black communities, he became proof that excellence could be undeniable, that success could be achieved in a country that often made success harder to reach. That kind of symbolism can be empowering, but it can also be suffocating. When you are the proof, you're not allowed to fail. When you are the role model, you're not allowed to have a weak day. When you are the icon, your private life becomes public property. The video hints at that tension without spelling every detail out. The idea that Magic was performing not just for a franchise, but for a nation's imagination. And imagination is greedy. It doesn't want the real person. It wants the story to stay clean. Then, just when it seems like there's nowhere left for him to climb, the stage gets even bigger. The early 1990s arrive, and the world starts watching American basketball as a global product, not merely a domestic league. Magic's image becomes international. His name travels faster than the teams do. And in that world, the expectation isn't just be great. It's be immortal. That is why the next shift feels so brutal. Because tragedy does not usually announce itself with dramatic music. It often enters quietly, like a door opening in the dark. On November 7th, 1991, Magic Johnson stood before reporters and said the words that changed everything. He had tested positive for HIV, and he was retiring from the NBA. The video treats the moment like a world-stopping event, and for that era, it was. Not only because a superstar was leaving the game, but because HIV carried an enormous weight of stigma, fear, and misunderstanding. This is where the narrative becomes less about sports and more about society. In 1991, HIV was widely seen as a death sentence. Many people did not understand transmission. Many people treated the disease like a moral label rather than a medical condition. And when Magic announced his diagnosis, he didn't just become a player with HIV. In the eyes of the public, he became the face of everyone's fear. The video emphasizes what that can do to a human being. The sudden distance, the awkwardness, the suspicion, the quiet rejection dressed up as caution. Teammates who once celebrated with him might hesitate. Strangers might look at him differently. Conversations might change tone. Even sympathy can feel cold when it comes with a step backward. What makes this chapter heartbreaking is not only the medical reality, but the emotional reality. It's the idea that the same world that cheered him could also treat him like an untouchable object the moment the narrative got complicated. And yet, the cruelest part is what happened in private. Because the cameras capture statements, not breakdowns. The public sees a controlled face. The private world gets the raw fear. The video paints Magic as a man sitting alone after the press conference, finally letting the smile fall. A man hearing his own heartbeat like a countdown. A man thinking about his wife, Cookie, pregnant at the time, thinking about the child on the way, thinking about whether he would live long enough to be present for the moments that matter. That is the true cliff edge. Not the loss of a career, but the possibility of losing time. And once fear enters, it doesn't come alone. It brings guilt. The survivor's guilt the video describes. Watching others succumb, wondering why he remains standing. It brings loneliness. It brings the sense that everything you achieved can suddenly feel irrelevant in the face of a disease and a society that doesn't know how to respond with compassion. In a strange way, the diagnosis resurrects the same emotional landscape from his childhood. Back then, he was ridiculed and reduced to something smaller than himself. Garbage man, trash boy, a label meant to shame. Now, decades later, he faces another label, HIV positive, that many people in that era treated as shameful. Different word, same cruelty. Society trying to flatten a whole human being into one ugly assumption. That is why this story hits as tragedy. Not because Magic's greatness wasn't real, but because greatness didn't shield him. Not because he didn't rise, but because life proved it could still pull the ground out from under him. The turning point in Magic Johnson's story is not a single event. It is a chain reaction, one press conference that detonated a private crisis inside a public empire, and then years of living in the aftershock. The video describes it like a door slamming shut. The NBA career ends, the headlines explode, and suddenly the man who once controlled every possession on the court cannot control how people look at him. In the days following November 7th, 1991, the world did what it often does when it is scared. It simplified. It reduced him. It treated HIV like a final chapter instead of a diagnosis. It treated a human being like a warning label. And because Magic's face was famous, the stigma attached itself to him faster than facts could catch up. The video leans into those small humiliations that hurt more than public drama. The hesitated handshake, the forced polite distance, the feeling that your presence makes people uncomfortable even when they pretend it doesn't. For someone who built his identity on being seen, this was a special kind of punishment. He had spent his life turning eyes into applause. Now eyes became suspicion. The worst part is that stigma doesn't stay outside. It walks in with you. The video suggests that the real collapse happened behind closed doors, after the cameras left, after the reporters filed their stories, after the phone stopped ringing. That is when the icon became a husband sitting in silence, a soon-to-be father staring at a ceiling, listening to his heartbeat like it was counting down his remaining days. Cookie is the emotional center of this turning point, because she represents the most brutal contrast in the entire narrative. What should have been the happiest season of their lives became a season of terror. She was pregnant. They were building a family. And suddenly, everything is filtered through one question. Who is safe? The video portrays her fear as constant and physical, clutching her belly at night, waiting for test results, praying the future hasn't already been stolen. And then comes the first miracle the story holds on to. Cookie tests negative. The baby tests negative. Relief floods in, but it is not the clean relief people imagine. It is relief with an aftertaste, because the tests solve one fear, but not the larger reality. Magic is still HIV positive. The stigma still exists. Their marriage will now be watched like a courtroom exhibit, judged by strangers who confuse gossip with truth. In that environment, love becomes a form of defiance. Staying is not passive. Staying is choosing to be present while the world is waiting for you to leave. The video frames Cookie's loyalty as the line that keeps Magic from falling into total darkness. Because it is one thing to lose a career. It is another thing to lose your sense that you deserve to be loved. But the turning point doesn't end with medical fear. It expands into identity, family, and legacy, because a public crisis rearranges private relationships in ways no trophy ever can. The video introduces Andre, Magic's eldest son, and the guilt that follows a father who was a hero to everyone except the person who needed him most consistently. Andre's story is not presented as scandal. It is presented as consequence. What happens when a man's life is consumed by spotlight, travel, ambition, and then abruptly redirected by illness. When you become sick, you begin counting what you might not have time to fix. And for Magic, that counting includes fatherhood. Then there is EJ, born into the family after the diagnosis, raised under a microscope, and later becoming a public figure in his own right. The video points to 2013 as another emotional pivot. EJ comes out as gay, and suddenly the Johnson family is again facing public judgment, again forced to navigate stigma, this time of a different kind, but with familiar cruelty. For Magic, it is a second test of the same principle. Will he allow society's fear to shape how he loves his child? The video presents his reaction as human, confusion, discomfort, fear. Not because he doesn't love his son, but because he knows what it feels like to be reduced to one label and punished for it. He fears EJ will be treated the way he was treated in 1991, as a headline before a human. That is the hidden tragedy in this father-son chapter. Even when you survive the event, you carry the memory of how people acted, and you become protective, sometimes clumsy, sometimes overwhelmed. But the story insists that love evolves. Magic learns. He listens. He shows up. And the simple image of him publicly supporting EJ becomes symbolic in a different way. Not the forced symbolism of perfection, but the real symbolism of growth, of a man choosing family over ego, choosing acceptance over fear. And then the video adds another blow. Elisa, the adopted daughter, and the 2018 home invasion that nearly kills her. This is where the turning point becomes something broader than HIV. It becomes the theme of a life repeatedly interrupted by the threat of loss. A man who spent decades fearing his own death now has to face the possibility of losing a child to violence. The video describes it like a recurring nightmare, proof that survival does not grant immunity from trauma. It only changes the shape of what you fear. By the end of this part, the turning point is fully transformed. It is no longer about an announcement in 1991. It is about what happens after, the long, grinding process of rebuilding a life in public while protecting a family in private. It is about learning that being an icon does not mean being safe. It is about realizing that the real battle is not to keep your image intact, but to keep your relationships intact while the world is staring. And it leads to a final question that sets the stage for the next chapter. If Magic Johnson could not control illness, stigma, and loss, what could he control at all? The video's answer is clear. Even if it is painful, he could control what he did with the pain. He could either let it swallow him, or he could turn it into something that outlived fear. The fallout of Magic Johnson's diagnosis was not a clean ending. It was a long, uneven collapse of certainty, one that played out in public headlines and private insomnia at the same time. The video describes it like a double life. Outside, the world saw a legend trying to look brave. Inside, a man was learning how fragile his body, his image, and his peace of mind really were. In the early 1990s, HIV did not simply threaten health. It threatened belonging. The stigma was so thick that even basic human gestures could become complicated. People feared proximity. They feared touch. They feared being associated with the wrong narrative. The video's language is dramatic, but the emotional truth is recognizable. When society is scared, it often chooses distance over empathy. That distance becomes its own disease. It isolates you, not because you are physically alone, but because you realize the world can change its posture toward you overnight. The most brutal fallout is that Magic's name became a symbol of HIV before many people were ready to understand what that actually meant. He had once been the face of joy and dominance. Now he was forced to become a public lesson in fear and prejudice. And no matter how disciplined he was, no matter how carefully he spoke, he couldn't control the rumors that arrived to fill every gap in public knowledge. The video captures this as a kind of humiliation, being famous enough that everyone thinks they have a right to your medical story, but lonely enough that very few people are willing to stay close. At the center of this fallout is the relentless presence of death. The video depicts Magic living like a man under a sentence, measuring time in heartbeats and pill schedules. Whether every detail is literal or stylized, the lived reality it points to is real for many patients. The psychological weight of a diagnosis is often heavier than the physical symptoms at first. Even when your body is functioning, your mind can act like the end is already happening. Nights become longer. Silence becomes louder. The future, once a wide road, shrinks into a narrow hallway. And then there's survivor's guilt, the quiet torment that the video returns to again and again. Magic watches people around him, friends, acquaintances, members of communities hit hardest by the AIDS crisis, fall one by one. Funerals stack on top of funerals. The question begins to scratch at him from the inside. Why am I still here? It's an awful kind of pain because it isn't just sadness. It's responsibility. It is grief mixed with shame, as if survival itself is something you have to justify. This is where the story becomes less about Magic the celebrity and more about Magic the witness. The video paints him standing in churches, hearing sobs, seeing mothers bury sons, realizing he could have been one of those bodies. And that awareness doesn't bring comfort. It brings a sense of debt, an invisible bill he can never fully pay. The tragedy of living longer than expected is that you have more time to carry the names of the people who didn't. Even when medical science begins to offer better treatment, the fallout doesn't simply disappear. Medication can stabilize a body, but it doesn't automatically heal the psychological scar of being labeled and feared. The video describes the pills as both salvation and reminder. Each dose keeps him alive, but each dose also confirms that he is living under conditions most people will never understand. Side effects, fatigue, anxiety, small daily taxes on survival. The kind of taxes that are invisible in interviews, because interviews reward optimism, not honesty. And yet, the fallout is also where Magic's public image begins to change in a different direction. He agrees to return for moments like the 1992 All-Star Game, and the world reacts as if it's seeing a resurrection. The video treats that game as a symbolic scene, applause, emotion, the sense that something impossible is happening. For many fans, it wasn't just about basketball. It was about hope. It was about seeing a man continue. But the video refuses to let that moment become a fairy tale. It emphasizes what happens after the applause, the exhaustion, the return to routine, the fact that one triumphant night doesn't erase the diagnosis the next morning. The public loves comeback scenes because they look clean. Real life is messy. The body still aches. The fear still visits at night. The mind still replays the moment the future cracked. The fallout also spreads into family, because no crisis stays contained within one person. Cookie becomes the quiet armor in this chapter. The video frames her not as a side character, but as the structural support holding the whole story up. She absorbs rumors. She absorbs public judgment. She stands in a place where outsiders feel entitled to ask, "How can you stay?" As if commitment is only valid when life is easy. Her choice to stay becomes a daily act of courage, because it isn't just about loving Magic. It's about choosing not to let fear dictate the boundaries of their home. And home, in this part of the story, becomes the only safe place. But even that safety is complicated. Magic isn't just fighting for himself. He's fighting for the right to remain a husband, a father, and a human being in a world that has decided his diagnosis is his identity. This is why the video's title lands so hard. The tragedy is beyond heartbreaking, not because he became sick, but because he had to carry the sickness and the stigma at the same time. HIV was the medical battle. Isolation, judgment, and the constant awareness of death were the emotional war. By the end of this Fallout chapter, one thing becomes clear. Magic Johnson did not move on from 1991. He learned to live with it. And living with it required a new kind of strength. Less glamorous than championships, less visible than highlight reels, but far more demanding, the strength to wake up, take the medication, face the world's eyes, and keep loving the people closest to him, even when he was terrified he might not have enough time. And that sets up the next transition. Because if survival feels like debt, then the only way to breathe again is to turn that debt into purpose, into work that outlives the fear, and into a legacy that is bigger than the diagnosis. If the early years after 1991 were defined by fear, stigma, and the exhausting work of simply staying alive, then the next chapter of Magic Johnson's story is defined by something rarer: control. Not control over the diagnosis, because HIV never stopped being real, but control over meaning. The video positions this period as the point where Magic stops living as a man waiting for death and starts living as a man determined to leave something behind that death cannot erase. The first shift is psychological. The world saw him as an icon, and icons are expected to be invulnerable. But Magic gradually learns a different form of strength, not pretending he is untouched, but choosing to be visible anyway. He speaks. He shows up. He lets his name carry the message that HIV is not a moral stain and not an automatic ending. This matters because at the time, stigma was one of the greatest barriers to prevention and treatment. When people are ashamed, they hide. When they hide, they avoid testing. When they avoid testing, they arrive too late. So Magic's decision to be public was not only brave, it was practical. From that logic, the foundation becomes inevitable. The video treats the Magic Johnson Foundation as the institutional expression of his private pain, a structured response to a world that had treated people with HIV as disposable. The foundation's mission is presented as direct and clear: awareness, testing, treatment support, especially for communities historically underserved by healthcare and education. In other words, the work isn't abstract charity. It is targeted intervention built around a reality he lived. Inequality determines who gets to survive. At the same time, the video makes a crucial point. Philanthropy alone was not enough for Magic to feel safe. He needed stability for his family, and he needed a second act that was not dependent on physical performance. That is where business enters, not as vanity, but as strategy. Magic Johnson's business trajectory is often summarized as he became a billionaire, but the story here is more specific. He invests where other investors refuse to look. He builds in neighborhoods that were written off. He opens doors to experiences people were told they didn't deserve. The video highlights partnerships like Starbucks locations in working-class areas and the development of movie theaters in underserved communities, moves that combine profit with a social thesis. Dignity is also infrastructure. If a neighborhood only receives neglect, it internalizes neglect. But if it receives investment, it can begin to imagine a different future. That is why the business chapter is framed as part of his survival. It is not a distraction from HIV. It is a response to it. When you live with a condition that makes tomorrow feel uncertain, you start measuring life differently. You stop counting only what you earn. You count what remains if you are gone. Each investment becomes a form of insurance, not merely financial insurance, but legacy insurance. And still, the video refuses to romanticize the transformation. It repeatedly returns to the quiet truth that success does not erase fear. Magic can sit in a luxurious office, sign deals, own stakes in major sports franchises, and still wake up with the old question humming in the background. Is today my last day? Medication keeps him alive, but medication also keeps him aware. The pill schedule becomes a daily reminder that life continues only because discipline continues. This is where the story becomes emotionally complex. To the public, Magic's second act looks like triumph, the athlete who overcame stigma and built an empire. But the video insists that the internal experience is not pure triumph. It is triumph built on vigilance, built on routine, built on the knowledge that he cannot afford to coast, because coasting is what people do when they believe the future is guaranteed. What makes this chapter compelling is that it shows how pain can become architecture. The foundation, the businesses, the investments, these are not random achievements stacked for prestige. They're a life designed to outlive a diagnosis. A life structured to repay the survivor's guilt through service. A life built to leave something in communities that once resembled Lansing. Working class, overlooked, mocked by people who never bothered to understand their potential. So the video's message in this section is clear. Magic's real victory is not that he stayed famous. It's that he stayed useful. He turned public stigma into public education. He turned private fear into public infrastructure. He turned survival into proof. And that leads naturally into the final stage of the narrative, what it means to reach 66. Not as an athlete chasing youth, but as a man learning to live with time, to accept the body's limits, and to measure happiness not by applause, but by family, peace, and the quiet miracle of waking up one more day. At 66, the most striking thing about Magic Johnson is not what he owns, or what he won, or how famous his name remains. It is that he is still here. In a story that began with poverty, accelerated into superstardom, and then nearly shattered under the weight of an HIV diagnosis, still here becomes the most meaningful achievement of all. The video frames his life at 66 as a paradox. He is older, physically less invincible, and more aware than ever that the body cannot be negotiated with. Yet he is also calmer, happier in a way the young Magic, trapped inside the demands of Showtime, rarely had permission to be. The earlier years were defined by speed. Speed on the court, speed of fame, speed of headlines, speed of fear. At 66, his life is defined by routine. And in this routine, you can hear a quiet form of victory. He wakes and does what many people take for granted. He cares for his health like it is a job. Exercise is no longer athletic ambition. It is survival maintenance. Diet is no longer preference. It is discipline. Medication is no longer an emergency response. It is a daily contract that extends life one day at a time. The video describes his regimen in almost ritual terms: Pilates, light cardio, controlled meals, pill schedules. This is not glamorous, but that is the point. Real survival rarely looks cinematic. It looks repetitive. It looks careful. And yet, even in this stability, the fear does not fully disappear. The video suggests that mortality remains a quiet companion, not screaming every day, but always present in the background. What scares him most is not fame fading. It is absence. Not being there when his family needs him. Not seeing another milestone. Not being able to protect the people he loves from the kind of pain he has witnessed so many times. This is why the story ends where it does, with family as the true center of his legacy. Cookie's presence remains the constant. Andre, once distant, becomes reconnectable. EJ's identity becomes a lesson in acceptance rather than conflict. Elisa's survival becomes proof that resilience can be inherited, taught, and practiced. The video makes a clear argument. Magic's greatest accomplishment is not 5 championships, but a home that held together through stigma, fear, public judgment, and the unpredictable violence of life. And outside that home, the legacy widens. He is not simply remembered as a player, but as a living counterargument to stigma. As someone who helped normalize testing, conversation, and hope at a time when fear was loud and information was scarce. As someone who invested in communities others ignored, turning business success into a statement about dignity and access. So the tragedy in this story is real. The loneliness, the stigma, the survivor's guilt, the years of living under the shadow of death, all of it matters. But the final note the video lands on is not despair. It is endurance. A man who was once reduced to labels, first by poverty, then by disease, refused to stay reduced. At 66, Magic Johnson is no longer the young superstar who had to be the brightest light in every room. He is something rarer, a man who has learned that the brightest light is not applause, wealth, or trophies. It is the ability to keep going, to keep loving, and to turn pain into a legacy that outlives fear.